In Andover, Maine, they didn't bury the dead, they planted them. And sometimes, the orchard gave them back. But never the same. If you're into unsolved mysteries, dark folklore, and true horror stories, buckle up. Because what I'm about to tell you is a chapter ripped straight out of America's hidden history. A chapter so deeply buried that not even Google Maps dares mark the town anymore. This is the story of Fairbanks Orchard, 40 acres of black soil on the outskirts of Andover County, where snow refused to fall and where silence grew roots deeper than any tree. It all started in the spring of 1839, when a man named Elias Fairbanks arrived out of nowhere and quietly bought that forgotten orchard land. No one knew why. No one saw him coming. By summer, a chapel had risen on the ridge, small, wooden, without a bell, without a cross, without even a name. Just walls breathing secrets. Elias spoke soft like a preacher. His wife Ada barely whispered, tending vines that never bore fruit. Their children, Nell, Mercy, and the boy they called Rev, pale as ghosts, unschooled, disciplined, and always watching. By autumn, gatherings began between the orchard rows. No sermons, no music. Only the sound of salt sprinkling on black earth and dirt shifting beneath bare feet. Locals who joined said it wasn't the words that haunted them, it was the silence afterward. A silence so thick, it rang in your ears like a hidden frequency. But this wasn't just some weird church group. This was something older. Something that knew how to listen. And it would mark Andover forever. Because people started to vanish. First a teenage girl named Catherine Halt. Then more. Strangers arrived on foot carrying satchels that smelled of earth and rot. The orchard bloomed out of seasoned petals shaped like mouths lined with teeth. And through it all, the boy called Rev stood in front of crowds whispering names and dates no one recognized until the bodies began to appear exactly when he said they would. So let me ask you, if the orchard opened behind your house tomorrow, would you step inside, stick around? Because this isn't just a creepypasta. It's a real cult mystery woven into America's soil. And the deeper we dig, the more we find the orchard has been waiting for us all along. In Andover, Maine, they stopped burying the dead. They started planting them. And sometimes, the orchard gave them back. But never the same. This isn't just a creepypasta or a campfire tale whispered in the dark. This is a piece of hidden American history, so twisted and so buried that even the maps don't show where the roads used to run. If you've ever scrolled YouTube at 3 a.m., searching for unsolved mysteries, real horror stories, or secrets that history tried to bury, then keep listening. Because the story of Fairbanks Orchard isn't just a story. It's a seed. And once you hear it, it starts to grow. On the outskirts of Andover County, Maine, there's a stretch of land where the soil turns black before it freezes solid. 40 acres of ground that refuse to hold snow. Trees that drip sap even in January. Locals said the dirt there smelled like iron and secrets. In the spring of 1839, a man named Elias Fairbanks arrived from nowhere and quietly bought that forgotten orchard. He paid in cash. The deed was filed by a traveling surveyor who left town before the week was out. By summer, a small chapel stood on the eastern ridge. It was made of narrow timber no higher than a barn. It had no bell, no signage, no cross. Just 4 walls that seemed to breathe if you stood close enough. People noticed. Of course they did. But in small American towns, people notice everything and say nothing. Elias Fairbanks wasn't some shouting preacher. He spoke in a voice soft enough to make you lean forward just to catch the words. Every sentence dripped with scripture. Not the fire and brimstone kind, but something older. Something you felt in your teeth. His wife Ada barely ever spoke. Neighbors said she was always out among the vines, her hands gently coaxing fruit that never came. Some folks claimed the vines grew in circles around her feet. They had 3 children, Nell, Mercy, and a boy so pale and silent that people stopped calling him by any name except Rev. By autumn of that same year, the Fairbanks family began hosting gatherings in the orchard rows. No music, no sermons, just flickering candlelight casting long shadows over the twisted branches. Locals drifted in, drawn by something they couldn't name. Some said it felt holy. Some said it felt like stepping into a room where everyone already knew your secrets. Sometimes it's not the words you hear that stay with you. It's the silence that follows. The gatherings were nothing like church. No hymns, no preaching. Just the crunch of salt being scattered on the soil and the quiet shifting of dirt beneath bare feet. People stood there in rows, breathing as if they were all waiting for a command. Farmers remembered that orchard for its bitter pears and 2 failed revivals. Twice before traveling, preachers had promised miracles and harvests, and twice the land was abandoned after a single winter. But the Fairbanks family stayed, and the orchard changed. By the spring of 1840, another structure rose beside the chapel. This one made of stone, windowless, with a heavy iron door so solid that a single family of 5 could never have built or moved it alone. When people asked Elias what it was for, he only said, "It's for containment." In Andover, containment was never about keeping things in. It was about keeping the rest of us out. The orchard drew people in. They came from neighboring towns, from as far away as Boston. No announcements, no flyers, just whispers. Whispers about prayers spoken in Latin and in a language no one recognized. Whispers about how the orchard stayed wet with sap, even in the dead of winter. Whispers that sometimes the orchard whispered back. Those who dared attend said they felt something staring through them from between the trees. Not a creature. Not even a presence. Just a sense that the orchard was listening. The orchard didn't want followers. It wanted witnesses. By then, people were coming just to feel seen. Because in Andover, secrets didn't stay buried. The orchard made sure of that. And that's how it began. A man with quiet eyes, a chapel with no cross, a stone house built for containment, and a stretch of trees that hummed under the soil like something alive. So I'll ask you this, if Mercy Fairbanks knocked on your door tonight, would you open it? Because some orchards don't feed the body. They feed on memory. ChatGPT said, in Andover, Maine, they stopped burying the dead. They started planting them. And sometimes, the orchard gave them back. But never the same. This isn't just a creepypasta or a campfire tale whispered in the dark. This is a piece of hidden American history, so twisted and so buried that even the maps don't show where the roads used to run. If you've ever scrolled YouTube at 3 a.m. searching for unsolved mysteries, real horror stories, or secrets that history tried to bury, then keep listening. Because the story of Fairbanks Orchard isn't just a story, it's a seed. And once you hear it, it starts to grow. Not every orchard grows fruit. Some grow replacements. On the outskirts of Andover County, Maine, there's a stretch of land where the soil turns black before it freezes solid. 40 acres of ground that refuse to hold snow. Trees that dripped sap even in January. Locals said the dirt there smelled like iron and secrets. In the spring of 1839, a man named Elias Fairbanks arrived from nowhere and quietly bought that forgotten orchard. He paid in cash. The deed was filed by a traveling surveyor who left town before the week was out. By summer, a small chapel stood on the eastern ridge. It was made of narrow timber, no higher than a barn. It had no bell, no signage, no cross. Just 4 walls that seemed to breathe if you stood close enough. People noticed. Of course they did. But in small American towns, people notice everything and say nothing. It's easier to ignore the strange until it starts knocking on your door. Elias Fairbanks wasn't some shouting preacher. He spoke in a voice soft enough to make you lean forward just to catch the words. Every sentence dripped with scripture. Not the fire and brimstone kind, but something older, something you felt in your teeth. His wife Ada barely ever spoke. Neighbors said she was always out among the vines, her hands gently coaxing fruit that never came. Some folks claimed the vines grew in circles around her feet. They had 3 children, Nell, Mercy, and a boy so pale and silent that people stopped calling him by any name except Rev. By autumn of that same year, the Fairbanks family began hosting gatherings in the orchard rows. No music, no sermons, just flickering candlelight casting long shadows over the twisted branches. Locals drifted in, drawn by something they couldn't name. Some said it felt holy. Some said it felt like stepping into a room where everyone already knew your secrets. Sometimes it's not the words you hear that stay with you. It's the silence that follows. The gatherings were nothing like church. No hymns, no preaching. Just the crunch of salt being scattered on the soil and the quiet shifting of dirt beneath bare feet. People stood there in rows, breathing as if they were all waiting for a command. Farmers remembered that orchard for its bitter pears and 2 failed revivals. Twice before traveling, preachers had promised miracles and harvests, and twice the land was abandoned after a single winter. But the Fairbanks family stayed, And the orchard changed. By the spring of 1840, another structure rose beside the chapel. This one made of stone, windowless, with a heavy iron door so solid that a single family of 5 could never have built or moved it alone. When people asked Elias what it was for, he only said, "It's for containment." In Andover, containment was never about keeping things in. It was about keeping the rest of us out. The orchard drew people in. They came from neighboring towns, from as far away as Boston. No announcements, no flyers, just whispers. Whispers about prayers spoken in Latin and in a language no one recognized. Whispers about how the orchard stayed wet with sap even in the dead of winter. Whispers that sometimes the orchard whispered back. Those who dared attend said they felt something staring through them from between the trees. Not a creature, not even a presence. Just a sense that the orchard was listening, cataloging. The orchard didn't want you to understand. It wanted you to surrender. By then, people were coming just to feel seen. Because in Andover, secrets didn't stay buried. The orchard made sure of that. And that's how it began. A man with quiet eyes. A chapel with no cross. A stone house built for containment. And a stretch of trees that hummed under the soil like something alive. So I'll ask you this. If Mercy Fairbanks knocked on your door tonight, would you open it? Because some orchards don't feed the body. They feed on memory. They say secrets rot if you bury them too deep. In Andover, Maine, they didn't bury secrets. They built houses to hold them. By the spring of 1840, the orchard wasn't just a place, it was a rumor with roots crawling across county lines. People were whispering about Fairbanks Orchard like it was a living thing, because maybe it was. The ground around it felt different, soft as if it was breathing under your boots. The air smelled of iron and something sweet like rotting fruit mixed with church incense. And inside that orchard, things were happening that no one could explain and even fewer dared to question. Neighbors began to speak of nights where the orchard shimmered beneath the moonlight, as though the bark of each tree was slick with oil. No snow would stick to the branches. No frost ever crept across the trunks. And all the while, Elias Fairbanks kept hosting gatherings under the trees, gatherings that were growing larger, drawing strangers who arrived on foot alone, wearing clothes marked with strange symbols no one could identify. These were pilgrims, some said seekers looking for something the churches had failed to give them. But others whispered a darker truth. These were people who had been called. One of the first to feel the orchard's call was a girl named Catherine Halt. 17. The daughter of a widow, smart, restless. One evening, people saw her slip through the orchard's edge, hands clasped as if in prayer, no coat, no lantern. Her mother claimed she was meeting Mercy Fairbanks for lessons. Mercy, who had begun tutoring girls that the town school had labeled too unruly, too sharp, too loud. But Catherine never came home. For 3 days, search parties combed the orchard. Elias Fairbanks himself guided them through the dark rows of trees, knowing each twist and knot like he'd carved them with his own hands. But there was no trace of Catherine. No footprints. No scraps of cloth. Nothing. And after the 3rd day, the searchers went home, silent, heads low, leaving Catherine's mother to keep the porch lamp burning for almost a year. Reverend Tillman, who had once tried to baptize the Fairbanks boy, said only this: "Some girls are born closer to the veil than others." And after that, he never spoke Catherine's name again. In the months that followed, the orchard's pull grew stronger, like gravity bending people toward it, whether they wanted to go or not. Strange things began happening. A boy from the Mayweather family came home with his chest slashed by cuts so precise they looked decorative. He whispered that it was part of a ritual cleansing and refused to let his mother dress the wounds. The orchard trees started humming a low, vibrating sound that rolled under the soil and made the bones in your ears thrum like tuning forks. Some claimed they saw hands folding and unfolding beneath the roots, as though the earth itself was praying. By winter, 2 families packed up and fled west without explanation, leaving cabins half-stocked and fields unharvested. People began avoiding the orchard, yet no one spoke of forbidding it outright, because the orchard seemed to hear everything. And it remembered. It wasn't just about religion anymore. It was about something older, something that felt like it had been waiting centuries to be remembered. And every day the gatherings grew, candles flickering in rows among the trees, while Rev stood silent at the front, watching with eyes so pale they looked like clouded glass. So let me ask you this. If you felt the orchard calling you by name, would you answer? Because in Andover, not all prayers went upward. Some sank deep into the soil and grew back as something else. They say the orchard never wanted fruit. It wanted names. By the fall of 1840, Andover was a town trembling beneath secrets that twisted through the branches like vines. Those who kept going to the Fairbanks gatherings came back quieter, their eyes darting like they were listening for whispers only they could hear. It was then that Elias built the stone house beside the chapel, a building with walls so thick it seemed to swallow every sound, a door bolted with iron fastenings so heavy 5 men struggled to move it, and when people asked Elias why he needed such a thing, he said only, "It's for containment." But no one ever dared ask containment of what. Inside the orchard, the rituals began changing. The silence grew deeper, as if even the wind refused to pass between the trees. People spoke of prayers no longer whispered in Latin alone, but in another language no one could place, a language that curled in your ears and lingered behind your eyes like a flicker you couldn't blink away. One night, Dr. Alton Greaves, a traveling physician delayed by snow, decided to see for himself. He left detailed notes scrawled in the margins of his almanac, describing a congregation so still he could hear the pop of sap freezing inside the trunks. Elias stood at the center, reading from a book with no visible writing. His voice, neither loud nor soft, but somehow making every hair stand on end. Women wept without sound. Men shook like leaves, but didn't move. And then the boy called Rev stepped forward, placed one thin hand on a young man's forehead, and the man dropped convulsing into the dirt, foaming at the mouth while no one lifted a finger to help. When it ended, Greaves wrote only 5 words underlined in dark charcoal. "They're not burying the dead," and he left town before dawn, refusing breakfast, refusing escort, leaving his coffee untouched as frost climbed the windows. After that night, people began talking about what the orchard wanted. Some said sacrifice, some said memory. Others claimed it wanted witnesses. Because a few weeks later, a boy from the Mayweather family came home with deep scratches carved across his chest, each line intersecting in a pattern too precise to be accidental. He said it was a ritual cleansing and wouldn't let his mother touch him. When the town's circuit preacher tried confronting Elias about these rumors, Elias simply invited him to observe the next gathering. The preacher never spoke of what he saw, and within a month he resigned his post and left for Vermont without saying goodbye. That winter, 2 entire families fled Andover in the middle of the night, their cabins left half-stocked fields frozen and unharvested. Yet even as people left, others arrived, drawn from distant towns, traveling on foot, wearing clothes stitched with symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. They came carrying prayer beads carved from bone, or satchels exhaling a sweet, rotting smell. No one knew their names. No one saw how they arrived, but Elias greeted each of them like old friends. And within days, a crude dormitory appeared beside the stone structure roof, lined with cypress bark instead of shingles, low windows that reflected nothing but darkness. And then, there were the letters. In March of 1842, Mercy Fairbanks began sending handwritten invitations, but only to the mothers. No fathers. The parchment bore no name, only a seal pressed with the outline of a split fig. Each message said the same thing: "We have seen her sorrow. We can return what was taken." Most women burned the letter at the hearth. But some, especially those who'd buried children, couldn't resist. Like Clara Dunn, whose baby had died during childbirth the year before. Clara returned from the orchard, pale as winter sunlight, clutching a muslin blanket. She insisted was the same one she'd buried in the tiny coffin. And when neighbors asked what had happened, she whispered, "He let me hold her again." But not for long. That night, Clara built a fire higher than her roof and stood beside it until dawn. No one asked what she burned. But after that, she never stepped foot in any other church. And in Andover, people learned an unspoken rule. The orchard didn't give things back. It only loaned them, and always at a cost. So let me ask you this. If the orchard promised you could hold the one you lost, would you step into those trees? Because in Andover, not all miracles come free. Some come dripping with sap and secrets, and the price of memory itself. ChatGPT said, "They say some places remember you long after you've forgotten yourself." In Andover, Maine, the orchard remembered everything. By midsummer of 1843, The boy called Rev was no longer just the pale child who stood silent beside his father. He was something else entirely, a presence that made grown men lower their eyes and women clutch the crosses at their throats. He'd never set foot inside a schoolhouse yet. The first time he opened his mouth in front of a crowd, every person heard his voice as clearly as if he'd whispered it directly into their ears, even those standing 50 feet away in the dark. One humid evening, Rev stepped forward at the gathering and spoke a list of names, each one followed by a date. None of the names belonged to anyone from Andover. No one recognized them, and yet something in the way Rev spoke left the listeners shivering as though the orchard itself leaned closer to hear. Weeks later, a family passing through Andover was found dead near Black Timber Creek. Their wagon untouched horses, still tethered bodies laid out as if for burial, each marked with the same cross-hatched wounds the Mayweather boy once showed on his chest. The date matched precisely the one Rev had whispered that night. The sheriff called it the work of highwaymen, but no one truly believed him, because in Andover coincidence was a luxury no one could afford. As the years bled into one another, the orchard began to show signs of life in ways that defied every season. In the summer of 1844, pale blossoms curled from every branch, though no bees came and no fruit followed. The petals never dropped. Children who wandered too close swore they heard humming beneath the soil, a low, steady sound that felt oddly musical, like a song being sung underwater. One little girl claimed she saw hands beneath the roots folding and unfolding as if in silent prayer. Her parents packed her off to live with cousins in another county, and she never spoke of it again. Because in Andover, speaking about the orchard was the fastest way to lose yourself. That same season, a new path appeared in the orchard. No one cut it. No axes, no spades. It simply manifested overnight, a winding trail pressed deep into the soil, as though some enormous weight had passed through broad indentations glowing faintly under moonlight. Elias began leading his evening gatherings along this path, carrying nothing but a single glass lantern that shone green instead of gold. Those who followed returned changed. Some came back radiant and smiling, eyes shining like they'd glimpsed heaven. Others came back silent for days, unable to speak, flinching at shadows. One boy named Ezra tried following alone. He returned before sunrise, barefoot, bleeding from the soles of his feet, his tongue severed so neatly it seemed almost surgical. His boots were never found. After that, no child dared enter the orchard without an adult, and even the adults were beginning to rethink how much faith they'd put in Elias Fairbanks and his silent son. Yet the orchard's pull only grew stronger, especially when strangers began arriving just before the harvest of 1845. They didn't come by wagon or coach, but on foot alone, trailing no family, and carrying nothing but small satchels stitched with symbols no one could translate. Some wore prayer beads carved from bone. Others carried bags that gave off a sweet, earthy rot that clung to clothes and hair. They never asked for lodging. They simply stood near the orchard at dusk waiting. Elias greeted each one by name, though no introductions were ever made. Within days, a crude dormitory appeared beside the stone structure. No windows. Low roof shingled with cypress bark. Locals watched them move in silence, building as if they'd done it 1,000 times before. Reverend Tillman, now long retired, watched from his window and called them pilgrims of the second soil. No one knew what that meant, but the name stuck whispered on wind that smelled of myrrh, and something older still. After their arrival, the ground around the Fairbanks orchard began to pulse faintly beneath bare feet, warm as if remembering fire. And then came Amos Cribben, an elder of the town, who one night stood up during supper and declared without emotion that he would offer his property to the Fairbanks. "The land doesn't need me anymore," he said. "It wants them now." His sons protested, but Amos had already burned the deed. That same night, he walked barefoot to the orchard, left his boots by the chapel door, and vanished into the trees. The next morning, townsfolk found a shallow depression in the soil, where the orchard met the pulpit, freshly turned, but without shovel marks, the scent of myrrh and vinegar rising from the dirt. Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just remember names. It remembered who was willing to give themselves up. And sometimes it decided to claim you, whether you offered or not. They say every town has a heart, but in Andover, Maine, the orchard was the heart, and it was still beating. By March of 1842, Mercy Fairbanks began sending letters, but not just any letters. These were invitations scrawled by hand on parchment, smooth as skin, folded with care, sealed not with wax, but with a crimson stamp pressed into the shape of a split fig. Each letter bore no greeting, no signature, only the same chilling message: we have seen her sorrow. We can return what was taken. And though the men of Andover never received a single one, the mothers did. Mothers who had lost daughters, infants, husbands. Mothers whose grief hung around them like a second skin. Most burned the letters as soon as they read the words, tossing the parchment into hearth flames that crackled like teeth snapping shut. But a few couldn't resist, because in Andover the orchard had a way of offering exactly what you wanted most, right when you were weakest. One of those women was Clara Dunn. Her baby had died in childbirth the previous year, buried in a tiny white coffin lined with a muslin blanket. Neighbors saw Clara return from the orchard days later, pale as frost, clutching that same muslin blanket against her chest. When someone finally worked up the courage to ask what had happened, she said only, "He let me hold her again." But not for long. That night, Clara built a fire higher than her rooftop and stood beside it until dawn, eyes unfocused, lips moving as if reciting prayers no one else could hear. No one ever asked her what she'd burned. But after that night she never entered any other church again. And in Andover that silence spoke louder than any confession. Because the orchard didn't just give you back what you'd lost, it took something from you in return. By the fall of 1846, the orchard's influence had spread beyond whispers and candlelight. People started speaking of a new structure rising out of the soil, not built of wood or stone, but of something darker, slicker like bark, weeping in rain. Children began calling it the Hush House, but the adults avoided naming it altogether, as if to speak its name might summon something listening just beyond the trees. People claimed its walls were lined with mirrors that reflected nothing at all, as though the glass remembered faces it refused to show. Inside, a stone basin sat where a pulpit should have been, and it wasn't filled with water, but with hundreds of loose teeth, yellowed sharp, piled like offerings, waiting for someone to count them. Even more terrifying were the silent processions that began at dusk. Led by Mercy Fairbanks, the orchard's pale child-turned-woman, these processions moved like a river through the orchard paths. Children first, then mothers. Then the elders, frail and stooped, each one holding a candle dipped in black wax, each wearing a length of linen tied tight across their mouths. Observers who dared hide in the tree line claimed the processions made no sound, not a footstep, not a breath, and that the door of the hush house would swing open of its own accord, and close again, only after the last candlelight slipped inside. Edna Parlow, the town's washerwoman, said she caught a glimpse through a crack in the hush house wall one night and saw reflections in the glass that didn't belong to anyone standing there. She spoke of walls pulsing like lungs of shadows moving independently of the bodies that cast them, of a stone basin, overflowing not with water, but with teeth, and something darker that smelled like old blood and salt. She said songs were being sung without sound, so deep you could feel them vibrating inside your ribs. The next day, Edna vanished. Her washtub remained full, the water clear and still despite the wind that howled from the orchard all night long. Andover was unraveling. Time itself seemed to warp. Days bled into one another, the sun refusing to rise or set at the right hours. The orchard remained impossibly green while fields outside withered in frost. People began waking up with dirt under their nails and couldn't remember how it got there. So tell me this, if the orchard promised you one moment with someone you'd lost, would you pay the price? Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just keep secrets, it kept receipts. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard never wanted your faith, it wanted your memory. By early November of 1846, strange figures began drifting into town. 3 siblings from the Northwoods arriving barefoot, eyes wide, with a kind of hunger that wasn't for food. The eldest, a girl of 15, carried a scar beneath her jaw, a jagged mark shaped like a fig pierced with thorns, half healed, half burning red. She spoke of a place beyond the forest where people spoke with needles instead of words, where skin turned red in place of parchment, where prayers were written in blood instead of ink. Her words made little sense, but every syllable seemed to shiver the air around her. The sheriff took them into custody, thinking perhaps they were runaways or victims of some cruel sect. But before dawn, the children vanished from the jailhouse, as if they'd never been there. The only clue left behind was a trail of pale blossoms scattered across the floor orchard petals, blooming weeks out of season. No footprints marked the streets, no wagon tracks led away. That night, fog rolled in thicker than wool, and from the chapel's bell frame, which had stood silent for years, came a single deep toll. No rope was rigged. No hand pulled the bell. Yet the sound crawled through the marrow of every bone in Andover, a low, vibrating tone that felt like a warning. By the winter's first freeze, the orchard trees began to bleed. Not sap, but a dark fluid thicker than blood, yet thinner than pitch, oozing from beneath the bark and pooling at the base of each trunk. Josiah Kemp, a farmhand drawn by curiosity and perhaps madness, collected a vial of the substance and carried it to the town apothecary. But the liquid hissed when exposed to air, eating through the cork and even the glass. By nightfall, Josiah fell ill, raving about hunger beneath roots fig above bone below. He died before dawn, his body decaying so swiftly that by morning nothing remained but a ring of dried soil in the shape of a crown. The orchard was declared cursed by those brave enough to speak it aloud. Yet no one truly left for good. Because in Andover, even those who fled would eventually find themselves drifting back, drawn like iron filings to a hidden lodestone beneath the soil. The final census before the records went missing listed a population of 116, but by the end of that year, fewer than half were ever seen outside their houses. Doors stayed shut. Curtains were drawn even on the sunniest mornings. Those who did venture out wore scarves high around their necks, fingers trembling as they held them in place. Children were seen tracing strange symbols in the dust fig shapes, rows of teeth and countless small mouths opening and closing. When asked what they were drawing, one child said, "I'm counting the ones who sleep standing up." Her parents called it an illness, but the sheriff marked the house for visitation. He never followed through. That same week, Miriam, not the schoolteacher, left her classroom in the middle of a lesson. She walked calmly to the orchard and stood motionless at the edge of the hush house for hours. When she returned, her fingernails were blackened, her voice gone, and she handed each of her students a torn page from her lesson book. Written across it in her own careful hand was the same sentence repeated 13 times: "You are remembered. You are remembered." On the final night of 1847, the bell tower in town rang 13 times at midnight. No mechanism was found intact. The ropes rotted away, the clapper long removed. Yet the tolls echoed clear across the valley, shaking windows and rattling pews. At that exact moment, a strange blue light pulsed under the hush house door, slow and rhythmic like breath. People swore they saw shapes on the roof, unmoving arms stretched wide as if inviting the town to step forward. Henry Mott, a farmer whose sister had died years before, claimed he saw her standing there beckoning. He ran toward the orchard, calling her name, and vanished into the fog so thick it swallowed him whole. By morning his boots sat neatly on the chapel steps, each one filled with earth and small white blossoms. And that day, for the first time in memory, no birds sang in Andover. The wind blew steady east, carrying secrets no one dared speak aloud. Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just harvest the living, it harvested time itself. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard never grew fruit to feed your body, it grew stories to feed your silence. By January of 1848, Andover was no longer a town that measured time in days or seasons. The sun rose and set, but nobody trusted the clocks anymore because hours seemed to stretch or vanish without warning, as if the orchard itself was twisting time like vines around a fence post. The frost came late and clung too long, and candles burned faster in some houses, refusing to light at all in others, as though deciding which families deserved illumination and which would remain in shadow. People stopped leaving town because those who tried found themselves somehow standing back on the orchard path before dusk, fell boots soaked in black sap, eyes vacant as though they'd been away for years and come home speaking a language no one recognized. Inside the town, even the Bibles began to change. Passages went blank, overnight pages fading as if scrubbed clean by invisible hands. Verses were replaced not with new words, but with faint indentations, ghost letters pressed into paper like whispers buried in snow. People accused each other of tampering, but soon they stopped speaking altogether. Because in Andover, speaking the truth could sometimes summon something that listened too closely. Margaret Bell woke one morning to find her marriage certificate missing, replaced by a scrap of vellum tucked into her mirror frame. It read in a trembling hand, "You were never his." That same day, her husband left without packing a single thing, without even putting on shoes. A week later, Margaret was found seated upright in a chapel pew, hands clasped around a piece of dried fig crusted in salt, her eyes sealed shut as though glued by sap. When someone tried to open them, her lids wouldn't part, and from between them seeped a thin trickle of black liquid that smelled like myrrh and earth. Sheriff Cross, still trying to hold the last threads of order together, climbed the church steeple daily with a spyglass recording movements at the orchard's edge. What he saw wasn't people. It was shapes shifting like reflections in rippled water, forming lines, and then dissolving only to reappear closer each time. They wore veils and cast no shadows. His journal, later found half-scorched, recorded one final line: "They do not bury the dead, they instruct them." No sign of Cross was ever found, except for his boots at the top of the steeple, placed neatly side by side, filled with dirt and tiny fig seeds. After that, the town stopped pretending to function. The post office closed. The schoolhouse bell cracked in half. The grain stores stood silent, untouched, even as families went hungry. In the hush before spring, the fig trees bloomed for the first time in over a year, but the blossoms were grotesque, shaped like tiny mouths filled with pearl-white teeth. When pressed between fingers, each petal released a single drop of salty water that glistened like tears. By March, the snow did not melt. It receded, pulled inward as if sucked into the earth. Underneath there was no green, no crocuses blooming, only the pale silver of exposed roots twisting like veins just below the skin of the world. Paths appeared where no one remembered walking. Stones surfaced in perfect circles, forming rings in fields long left fallow. The orchard's silence grew so heavy that even breathing near its edge felt intrusive. People described hearing pages turning, though no books were visible, as though the orchard itself was reading from a history written in dirt and blood. And just after the equinox, the sky opened, not with rain, but with falling ash, a soft gray dust that spiraled downward for 13 minutes. It carried no heat, no smell left, no residue once touched. But those caught in it felt a weight pressing on the back of their necks, like someone had leaned close to whisper their name. Those who turned saw nothing. Those who didn't dreamed in Latin that night, recalling words they'd never been taught. Children became the first to vanish in daylight, slipping away not from beds or woods, but from within arm's reach. One boy disappeared mid-sentence in class, his smile frozen, as though someone had pressed pause on a reel of film. So I have to ask you, if the orchard offered to erase your worst memory, would you take the deal? Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just trade in souls, it traded in silence, and silence was a debt you could never repay. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard didn't just grow trees, it grew replacements. By the time spring of 1848 unfurled over Andover, the hush around town was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. The orchard was changing in ways no one dared name. Beyond the bend where the fig trees leaned in synchronized arcs, stood a new shape rising from the earth, tall and narrow, colorless, fashioned from something that was neither stone nor wood nor iron nor flesh, but somehow a dark fusion of all of them, pulsing gently as though it had a heartbeat of its own. Its entrance bore no hinges, no seam, only a slit just wide enough for a man to slip sideways if he stripped off every piece of clothing. People stared at it from a distance, some crossing themselves, others standing silently, drawn closer, even as fear made their fingers twitch. The first to test it was Enoch Weaver, a veteran once hailed as unshakable, who dropped his clothes without hesitation and stepped into that narrow slit as though into his own grave. He didn't come back. The slit remained unchanged for hours, silent and dark, until 13 birds landed upon the chapel steeple, each one facing west, each one unmoving, feathers ashen and eyes unblinking. By dawn, the slit had closed, sealing itself so seamlessly that no one could trace where the opening had been. Inside, Andover records started disappearing. Bibles on nightstands were found with entire verses missing, leaving behind nothing but faint ridges pressed into the paper as if words had been written there centuries before and then scraped away. People awoke to find documents missing their own names, absent from marriage records, deeds, baptismal lists, as though the orchard was pruning not just branches, but entire identities. Margaret Bell woke to discover her marriage certificate gone, replaced by a scrap of vellum tucked into her mirror frame that read, "You were never his." That same day her husband left without shoes or a bag, as if led by a voice only he could hear. A week later, Margaret was found seated upright in the chapel pews, her hands clasped around a piece of dried fig crusted in salt. Her eyelids were sealed shut, and when someone tried to pry them open, a thin line of black liquid seeped out carrying a smell of myrrh and soil. Sheriff Cross, trying desperately to impose some semblance of order, took to the steeple daily with his old spyglass, watching the orchard's edge. What he saw were not people, but shifting shapes moving like memories half-remembered, flickering in and out of visibility, sometimes forming into lines that dissolved and reformed closer each time, as though rehearsing a silent march. He wrote in his ledger, a final entry before vanishing. They do not bury the dead. They instruct them. No trace of him remained except his boots neatly left atop the steeple, each one filled with dirt and fig seeds. From that day forward, the town stopped pretending to be a town. The post office closed its doors forever. The schoolhouse bell cracked and lay silent. The grain stores stood untouched while the people grew thinner and paler, avoiding each other's eyes, as though a single look might expose secrets best left buried. In that hush, the fig trees bloomed once again, blossoms opening like mouths ringed with pearl-white teeth. Pressed between fingers, each petal released a droplet of salt water that shimmered like a tear. The orchard seemed to swell with silent music, as if hundreds of unseen voices were humming a hymn older than any language ever spoken. One morning, the door to the slit tower stood ajar once again, but this time the opening was round, gaping like a mouth forced wide. 13 townspeople approached without words, rising from their homes as if summoned by a dream. Each left behind a token: a lock of hair laid gently on a pillow, a child's shoe placed outside the threshold, a comb resting in a basin of salt. No one tried to stop them, because in Andover there was nothing left to stop anything at all. So tell me this. If the orchard offered to remember you when the world forgets, would you walk through that slit? Because in Andover the price of memory wasn't measured in years. It was measured in who you were willing to leave behind. ChatGPT said they say in Andover, Maine, the orchard didn't wait for you to find it. It came looking for you. By the 13th day after the slit tower last opened, smoke began to pour from its seams, not black, not white, but a thick green haze that hung low to the ground, curling into homes like a living thing. It carried a bitter metallic scent sharp enough to sting the eyes and catch at the back of the throat. Those who breathed it found themselves forgetting things: a name, a birthday, the sound of a mother's laugh. Once those memories were gone, they did not return. People wandered their own kitchens like strangers, staring at portraits on the walls and weeping because the faces looking back were no longer familiar. Naomi Clay discovered her wedding dress laid neatly across her bed, still warm as if someone had just finished pressing the last fold. She touched it and began crying, whispering, "I don't remember who sewed this." The town clock, which had not worked in over a decade, suddenly chimed once at the precise moment Naomi fell silent, even though its hands still pointed stubbornly to midnight. Andover was no longer a town. It was becoming something else entirely, a place where fig branches began creeping along baseboards inside homes, sliding through cracks in the plaster, pulsing faintly, as though they remembered breath. People hesitated to cut them, because the wood felt alive under their fingers, radiating heat like skin. Children began whispering that the trees weren't invading at all, but returning to reclaim what had always been theirs. This was always their house, one boy murmured, tracing circles in the frost on a window pane. We just borrowed it while they were underground. When asked who they were, he glanced toward the hush house and whispered, "The saints we planted." Letters began arriving at the church, each one sealed with dark green wax, bearing a crown of thorns. Inside, written in a script no one could decipher, were passages that seemed to vibrate in the air when read aloud. The town's last remaining schoolteacher, who'd lost both her husband and her voice that year, locked herself in the vestry for hours, trying to translate the script. When she emerged, her feet were bare, her eyes pale as bone, and she walked straight into the hush house without looking back. She never returned. Her journal was left behind on her desk, containing a single line scrawled over and over until the ink carved deep grooves into the paper. The orchard knows the shape of every name we've buried. It has not forgiven us. Each night, even though no one dared light the chapel lamps, a soft silver glow spilled from the windows. Those who passed by claimed to see figures kneeling in the pews, each face-veiled, mouths hanging open in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the ribs. They weren't praying. They were listening. And the thing they listened to was older than scripture, older than the town itself. In the final weeks before Andover slipped off maps forever, the sound returned, a bell tolling so deep it vibrated through the earth, not through the air. Water and wash basins quivered with each strike. Floors shivered as though the soil beneath the houses was alive and shifting. People stopped sleeping altogether because dreams became more terrifying than the waking world. In those dreams, stairwells spiraled down into root systems, pulpits were crafted of bone and vine, and doorways were sewn shut with human hair. Yet the worst part wasn't the visions. It was the voice that echoed from beneath the orchard, low and infinite, speaking no language yet understood by everyone. It whispered, "You are the fruit of silence. You will ripen in time." One morning the orchard's slit tower gaped open once again, but this time the opening had morphed into a perfect circle, wide and hungry, like a mouth forced to scream. 13 townspeople rose from their beds and walked barefoot toward it without speaking. They left tokens behind: a child's single shoe, a lock of hair braided with thread, a comb laid in a basin of salt. No one tried to stop them because there was nothing left in Andover capable of standing in the orchard's way. So let me ask you this. If the orchard promised to remember you long after the world forgot, would you let it swallow your name? Because in Andover, the price of being remembered was everything you'd ever hoped to forget. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard never truly disappeared. It just folded itself into the silence and waited. In the days that followed the final tolling of the bell, the orchard seemed to swell outward, though no new trees were planted and no axes were lifted. Instead, the land itself began to tilt subtly toward the grove, as if pulled by some hidden tide too ancient to resist. Fences leaned, stones sank into the soil, and entire foundations creaked in the night, shifting on invisible waves. A blacksmith's barn slid 2 feet across frozen ground without storm or earthquake, its beams splitting like bone. When the villagers crept inside, they found every tool arranged in the shape of a human hand. Not a drawing, but a perfect map of knuckles and fingers, with the anvil set like a palm. The blacksmith packed a cart and tried to flee, but 3 mornings in a row, he was found circling the orchard, pale and hollow-eyed, until on the 4th day he died in his sleep, his mouth packed with fig seeds, his eyelids crusted with salt. The doctor who examined him refused to record the death, muttering only, "He's not the first to come back wrong. He's just the first who didn't stay." At night the chapel began to hum again, not with voices but with a deep vibration that crawled through the walls and settled into the ribs, as though the wooden beams themselves were remembering old songs. Those who lived closest to the orchard woke at the same moment each night, precisely 3:16 a.m. Each one described hearing footsteps in their houses, slow, deliberate, never hurried. The rooms filled with the scent of damp soil and fig bark. In one home, a woman woke to find her daughter standing at the window, her back turned to the room, hands folded neatly. The child's eyes were closed, but tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered without turning, "They're almost finished remembering me. Just a little longer." The next morning the child was gone. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Only 13 small handprints pressed into the frost outside, all pointing toward the grove. That week, 13 letters arrived at the church, each addressed to names that no longer appeared on any census rolls, sealed with dark green wax marked by a thorned crown. Inside was a single sheet covered in looping script no one could read. The town's last school teacher, her voice long since vanished, studied the letters for hours behind locked doors. When she emerged, she walked barefoot into the hush house, never to be seen again. Her journal remained open on her desk, the final entry scratched deep into the paper until the pen tore through. The orchard knows the shape of every name we've buried. It has not forgiven us. No one lit the chapel lamps anymore, yet every evening a silver glow leaked from the windows. Those who passed swore they saw figures kneeling in the pews, faces hidden behind veils, mouths wide open as though drinking in some silent hymn. They weren't praying. They were listening. And whatever they were listening to was not of this world. In those final weeks, the hush house door stood open once more. Inside, the pews had returned, but they no longer faced the altar mound. Instead, every seat was turned toward the rear wall where a mirror had been hung. Yet the mirror reflected nothing but the viewer, and behind them always the same image, a single tree bent and split, weeping salt. Sheriff Cross's journal ended there, the last page blank, except for the smell of earth blood and myrrh. When held over flame, the paper darkened but refused to burn, and for an instant a child's voice whispered from its folds, "We are what was buried, and we are growing back. So tell me this. If the orchard offered to remember you forever, even as the world forgot your name, would you let it?" Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just hold secrets, it planted them. And every secret was waiting to sprout. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard was never just trees. It was a question waiting to be answered. By the second week of April, the orchard's expansion became undeniable. No new saplings had been planted, but the ground itself seemed to lean toward the grove, drawn, as if the soil had finally confessed who it loved. Houses tilted on warped foundations, fences buckled inward, and paths curved subtly until they all pointed to one place. A blacksmith's barn, which had stood on solid stone for 40 years, glided 2 feet overnight without a sound, its timber beams splitting like dry bones. When the villagers stepped inside, they found every hammer, tong, and file arranged to form the perfect outline of a human hand, the anvil sitting in the middle like a palm. The blacksmith packed his cart and fled, only to be found days later circling the orchard 3 times, eyes hollow and voice gone. On the 4th morning he died in his sleep, his mouth full of fig seeds and his eyelids crusted in salt. The town doctor refused to write a cause of death, whispering instead, "He's not the first to come back wrong. He's just the first who didn't stay." By then the humming in the chapel walls was constant, like an organ playing beneath the floorboards, a low frequency that crawled through the marrow of every person who dared stand close enough to listen. Those living nearest to the orchard found themselves waking at precisely 3:16 a.m. each night, as though summoned by the same unseen conductor. Footsteps echoed across wooden floors, slow and deliberate, never hurried, as if someone walked from room to room, memorizing the shapes of each wall. The air smelled of wet soil and the faint sweetness of fig bark. One woman woke to find her daughter standing rigid at the window. Eyes closed, tears streaming down her face, her voice a hush as she whispered, "They're almost finished remembering me. Just a little longer." The next day, the child was gone. No broken locks, no footprints. Only 13 tiny handprints pressed into the frost outside, all pointing back toward the orchard. Letters began arriving at the church, addressed to names that hadn't appeared in any census for years. Each envelope was sealed with dark green wax marked by a crown of thorns. Inside was a single sheet of parchment written in a language no one recognized, lines of script that seemed to shimmer and shift when read aloud. The town's last surviving schoolteacher, who hadn't spoken in months, locked herself in the vestry, poring over the symbols until her fingertips bled. When she finally emerged, she walked barefoot into the hush house and never came back. Her journal sat open on her desk, stained with tears and ink filled with the same sentence written over and over, until the page was nearly shredded. "The orchard knows the shape of every name we've buried. It has not forgiven us." Nobody lit the chapel lamps anymore, yet each evening a pale silver glow leaked out through the windows. Those passing claimed they saw shadows kneeling in the pews, their faces veiled, mouths stretched wide, as though drinking in an invisible sermon. They weren't praying. They were listening. And whatever they were listening to was older than scripture, older than any human tongue. In those last weeks, the hush house door stood wide open. Inside, the pews had returned, but now faced the rear wall where a massive mirror hung. Yet the mirror reflected nothing, not the room, not the pews, only the viewer, and always behind them, the image of a single fig tree bent and split, weeping salt from a wound in its trunk. Sheriff Cross's ledger ended abruptly. The final page bore no words, only the scent of myrrh and earth. When held to a flame, the paper darkened but would not burn. For a brief second, a child's voice whispered from within the folds, "We are what was buried, and we are growing back." So I have to ask you this. If the orchard offered you the chance to be remembered forever, even as the world forgot your name, Would you let it plant your story among its roots? Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just keep secrets, it harvested souls, and each soul was a seed waiting to sprout. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard never let anything end. It only folded each story into the dirt, waiting for the right season to grow it back. By the time the last days of Andover trickled into the year's close, the orchard had become something far beyond roots and branches. It was as though the very soil beneath the town was breathing, drawing in secrets and exhaling memories that didn't belong to anyone still alive. The streets were deserted even under bright sun, and in the shadows fig branches crept along baseboards inside homes, winding around furniture as if searching for something they'd once been promised. People stopped fighting back. They left the branches alone because when they touched the wood, it pulsed gently, like the skin over a beating heart. Children were the first to accept the orchard's quiet invitation. They began to hum melodies no one had taught them, old hymns that tasted like rust on the tongue. One boy was found sitting in the dirt behind the hush house, his fingers tracing endless spirals into the soil. When asked what he was doing, he said, "I'm drawing the mouths, so they know who's ready." His parents took him away, but they were seen a week later walking barefoot down the orchard path, leaving behind boots neatly set side by side on their porch, each one filled with salt. 13 women gathered under a moonless sky near the orchard's edge. None of them had spoken to one another about what drew them there, yet each arrived carrying a small object wrapped in linen, a tooth, a feather, a lock of hair, a photograph, a ribbon stained with tears. These were the remnants of the lost bits and pieces of people who were no longer there but whose absence still throbbed like phantom limbs. One by one they laid these offerings gently on the earth, but the ground refused them, leaving the linen bundles untouched, unmoved even by the sharpest winter wind. Only when the final item, a rosary burned black at one end, was placed on the soil, did the orchard stir, exhaling a low breath that rustled every branch in a synchronized shiver. Every tree tilted inward as though listening. From the slit tower, a humming began, deep and sonorous, shaking frost from the limbs. The women began to weep, not out of fear but relief. They had been heard. Yet the next day no animals were seen anywhere near town. Dogs refused to cross thresholds, horses bucked and refused to be harnessed, and even the crows that once circled overhead seemed to vanish into the wind. Only the fig trees remained in motion, swaying rhythmically, even when the air lay still as glass. At dawn, the hush house stood with its door wide open. Inside, the pews had returned, but none faced the altar mound anymore. Each one now pointed toward the rear wall where a massive mirror had been mounted. Yet the mirror reflected nothing. No pews, no altar, only the viewer. And behind them the image of a single fig tree bent and split its bark, glistening as it wept, salt like tears. Those who dared to look into the glass came away, changed eyes hollow, speaking softly of how the orchard was remembering them too. By then the orchard's influence had bled so thoroughly into the town that even mundane things betrayed its reach. Water from the well tasted faintly of iron and fig sap. Footprints appeared overnight in perfect circles in the frost, sometimes so small they looked like they'd been made by children, other times too large for any human foot. And across windows delicate frost patterns formed, always in the shape of the spiral, the fig, and the listening mouth. Sheriff Cross's journal ended with pages stuck together as though glued by sap. No one ever read the final words, but some claimed that when the pages were pried apart, they heard a voice from between the leaves whispering, "We are what was buried, and we are growing back." So let me ask you this. If the orchard promised to let you keep your secrets forever, but only if you joined its roots, would you step inside? Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just harvest memories, it planted them. And some were ready to bloom. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard was the only place where silence could speak louder than screams. By the final days before Andover vanished from every known map, the orchard's presence had become more than legend. It was a force of nature that reshaped the town without a single hand touching wood or stone. People who once tried to fight it fell quiet, as though the orchard had somehow peeled away the layer of self that kept them tethered to the rest of the world. Paths through the town twisted like serpents, leading wanderers back to the same spot near the orchard's edge, no matter which direction they turned. Stones that had been buried for decades surfaced overnight in perfect circles, their smooth faces etched with fig leaves and rows of tiny open mouths. In the black hours before dawn, the orchard hummed low and constant, a sound felt in the ribs more than heard by the ear. It was a vibration that made windows shiver and water ripple in bowls left by bedside tables. Inside the hush house, pews once again rearranged themselves, now facing a massive mirror on the back wall. People who stepped in front of it saw no reflection of the room, only themselves. And behind them, always the same gnarled fig tree, bent and split sap glistening like wet tears. No matter how they turned their heads, that tree remained watching. Some townsfolk claimed that when they leaned closer to the glass, they could hear voices murmuring from deep inside the orchard, whispering secrets in Latin and in a tongue no human tongue had ever spoken. At night, silver light spilled from the chapel even though no lanterns burned. Shapes knelt in the pews, each one shrouded in veils, their mouths gaping open but making no sound. It was said they were not praying, only listening, and what they were listening to was older than scripture and older than sin itself. Across town, fig branches continued their slow crawl into every home, weaving into baseboards, curling around bedposts. People started speaking less, their conversations reduced to single words, exchanged like passwords. Neighbors passed one another on dirt roads without even raising a hand in greeting, terrified that the orchard might be listening. And then the sky cracked open, not with rain but with falling ash. For 13 minutes, a soft gray dust fell like snow, carrying no heat, leaving no residue on skin. Yet those caught in it felt a pressure on the backs of their necks, as though someone was standing just behind them whispering their name. Those who turned around saw nothing. Those who kept facing forward dreamed that night in languages they never learned, waking with dirt under their nails and blood at the corners of their mouths. Children were the first to vanish entirely in broad daylight. A mother in the southern quarter watched her daughter dissolve into a beam of sunlight streaming through a parlor window, leaving only a scattering of fig petals on the floor. Another boy disappeared mid-sentence during a lesson. His classmates could not remember what he'd been saying, only that he'd looked up, smiled, and then simply wasn't there. Miriam. Not the schoolteacher who once scrawled, "You are remembered" 13 times on the chalkboard, left her bell on the desk, and walked barefoot into the orchard. Her shoes were later found hanging from a fig branch, laces woven seamlessly into the bark, as though the tree itself had claimed them. The slit tower opened just once more. A single child's scream echoed from its depths, not a sound of terror but of recognition, as if someone had finally remembered their true name after years of forgetting. That same night, 13 fig trees in the northern orchard bore fruit for the first time in living memory. The figs were pale and waxy, each one pressed with the impression of an ear into its flesh. The doctor who tried to dissect one bled from his nose for 2 days and lost the hearing in his left ear. He later wrote in his journal, "The fruit listened to me, too." A week later he was found hanging in his attic, a single fig leaf tucked into his mouth. So let me ask you this. If the orchard promised to listen to your deepest secrets, would you let it keep them? Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just harvest souls, it harvested stories, and some stories refused to stay buried. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard didn't just remember the past, it rewrote it. By the final spring, before Andover faded entirely from every map, the orchard's roots seemed to have sunk so deep they were touching something older than time. The snow retreated not in melting rivulets, but as if drawn downward by unseen hands, revealing soil pale as bone and threaded through with silver veins that twisted and pulsed just below the surface. Crocus and grass refused to grow, leaving only the bare earth exposed like skin peeled back to show the veins beneath. Paths appeared where no one remembered walking, weaving through fields in elaborate spirals marked by stones polished to a dull gleam. People started finding objects emerging from the thaw, wedding rings belonging to couples, long dead children's shoes, untouched by decay, a single muslin blanket, still damp, as though fresh from the grave. It was as if the orchard had begun exhuming its own history piece by piece, forcing Andover to reckon with secrets it thought safely buried. In those days, silence became so oppressive that entire families communicated only through gestures. Because in Andover, even a single whispered word might be heard by something waiting just beyond the trees. Inside the hush house, the pews shifted again, turned away from the altar mound, and now all facing the rear mirror. Those who dared look into it claimed they saw not themselves, but strangers whose faces blurred at the edges like figures trapped between one moment and the next. Behind these strangers stood the same twisted fig tree weeping salt from wounds that never closed. Some viewers staggered out mumbling fragments of Latin prayers. Others fell silent for good lips pressed tight as though stitched shut from the inside. The orchard's influence grew bolder. At dawn, fig branches began threading through shutters and window frames, brushing against cheeks as people slept. Some woke up with slivers of bark embedded beneath their fingernails, blood mingling with sticky sap. A widow named Clorinda Welsh, parched beyond reason, drank from her well at dusk, and by dawn she had forgotten the names of her children, then the shape of her own hands, then the meaning of words altogether. She was last seen standing before the chapel window, tracing spirals into the glass, with her breath a faint grin splitting her face while her reflection twisted behind the pane. 13 women gathered at the orchard's edge under a sky so cloudless it looked polished. None of them had spoken about why they came yet. Each carried an object wrapped in linen, a feather, a photograph, a strand of hair, a tooth. These were remnants of the vanished pieces of people who no longer belonged to the world of the living. They laid each item gently on the earth, but the orchard rejected them at first, leaving the bundles untouched and still. Only when the last woman placed a burned rosary on the ground did the orchard shiver with a deep inhalation. The trees tilted inward, leaves rustling in perfect unison, and from the slit tower came a hum so low it vibrated through bone. The women began to cry, not in fear, but relief. They'd been heard. Yet after that night no animals would cross into town. Dogs cowered behind fences. Horses refused harnesses. Even the crows abandoned the skies. Only the fig trees continued their subtle dance, branches swaying though no breeze stirred. At dawn, the hush house door stood open. Inside, every pew now faced the mirror. Those who stepped inside said the glass held not a reflection, but an endless corridor lined with fig trees, each bearing fruit shaped like ears, each dripping salt, and whispering secrets in a language that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to memory. Sheriff Cross's journal was found years later, stuck together with resin. When pried open, a single sentence filled the final page. "We are what was buried, and we are growing back." So I'll ask you one last time. If the orchard offered to rewrite the worst thing that ever happened to you, would you let it? Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just remember stories, it rewrote them. And sometimes, it rewrote you. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard was never just soil and branches. It was a doorway, and the key was your name. By the time Andover's last spring bled into summer, the orchard was no longer content to wait quietly in the shadows. It began pushing itself outward, seeping into the town like water through cracks in old stone. People who ventured near its edges came back, altered their voices softer, their eyes unfocused, as though peering through a veil none of the rest could see. Paths curved subtly toward the grove, drawing carts, footsteps, even the wind itself, as though the orchard's breath had become the tide that pulled everything closer. The orchard wasn't just alive, it was awake, and it was hungry for stories. The townsfolk discovered that the orchard had begun exhuming secrets no one remembered burying. Under the thinning snow, objects surfaced: tiny muslin blankets stiff with salt rings once slid onto trembling fingers at wedding altars, dried fig branches tied with hair. Even the earth seemed to heave with effort, pushing these artifacts to the surface like bones forced up from a shallow grave. People tried to ignore them, tried to burn or bury what the orchard offered, but the objects returned, laid carefully on doorsteps by unseen hands. Because in Andover, what the orchard dug up was never meant to stay buried. Inside the hush house, the air grew warmer day by day, as though the building was exhaling. Pew after pew now faced the great mirror, which no longer simply reflected. Those who dared look claimed they saw corridors lined with fig trees, each fruit dripping with a salt that shimmered like liquid glass. Voices rose from within the mirror, speaking in low murmurs that wormed into the mind, twisting old memories into new shapes. Some people ran from the hush house screaming, clutching at their heads. Others simply stood and stared until someone had to lead them gently away. Sheriff Cross's journal, discovered long after the town had emptied, contained a single jagged entry: "The orchard is remembering for us. And it's remembering things that never happened. Even nature bent to the orchard's will. Water in wells tasted faintly of iron and sweet fig sap. Livestock refused to drink, leaving troughs untouched, while the orchard trees shimmered with sap, even in dry heat. People reported dreams so vivid they woke with scratches on their skin, in patterns that matched the scars once seen on the Mayweather boy's chest. Some claimed that the orchard didn't just show them visions, it offered them bargains. A voice would come to them in the darkness, gentle as a mother whispering to a feverish child, offering to rewrite a single moment of their past. Erase a mistake. Bring back someone lost. Change one truth that had splintered their hearts, but always at a cost. Because in Andover, the orchard never gave anything for free. It always demanded a piece of you in return. Children began humming songs, no one taught them tunes that tasted metallic on the tongue. One boy was found pressing his palms into the dirt behind the hush house, whispering, "The roots are listening." When his mother pulled him away, she found his hands stained with sap, and letters traced into the soil in a language no one could read. Days later, that same boy vanished, leaving only a pair of boots at the orchard's edge, soles facing outward as if he'd been swallowed backward into the trees. The orchard didn't just hold the past, it reshaped it. People began forgetting who they were, then remembering different versions of themselves, like pages torn from different books and stitched together by trembling fingers. A woman who once swore she was childless woke up singing lullabies to an empty crib. A man who had buried his brother claimed he saw him each night tending fig trees with a blade made of salt. So let me ask you, if the orchard offered to carve away your deepest regret and replace it with something beautiful, would you pay the price? Because in Andover, the orchard didn't just feed on secrets. It fed on the very idea of who you believed yourself to be. They say in Andover, Maine, the orchard's final harvest wasn't fruit or bodies. It was certainty. And maybe that's the deepest horror of it all. Because certainty is the one thing the human mind craves more than food, more than love, more even than freedom. We all want to believe we know who we are, where we belong, and what the world will look like when we open our eyes tomorrow. But in Andover, the orchard proved that certainty is an illusion. That every memory can be rewritten, every identity, reshaped, every truth traded away like coin. The real terror wasn't in the bleeding trees or the humming walls, it was in how willingly people gave themselves over to silence for the promise of erasing their pain. Look around your own life for a moment. How many things have you buried just beneath the surface? Regrets, losses, secrets so heavy they ache in your chest when you try to sleep. And tell me honestly, if something whispered that it could lift those memories out of you, if it promised you peace in exchange for forgetting, would you really say no? Because here's the truth, Andover teaches us sometimes. The scariest monsters aren't the ones outside the window, but the soft voice inside our own heads offering to make the hurting stop. If only we'd let go of who we are. But the orchard's other lesson is this: silence is never free. In Andover, people traded questions for calm, grief for numbness, memory for quiet. And the price was everything that made them human, their history, their bonds, their very names. Because we are the sum of what we've survived, our scars, our tears, even the nights we wish we could erase. That's our map home to ourselves. And without that map, we're just wandering shadows in someone else's orchard waiting to be harvested. So tonight, wherever you are, curled up in bed, commuting under city lights, or sitting in silence you can't quite explain, remember this: the pain you carry is proof you're alive. And though it can feel impossible to bear, it's also the thing that keeps your roots planted in the real. Don't trade it away, no matter how sweet the offer sounds, because the price might be your name. And your name is sacred. If you've felt the orchard's call in your own life, the pull to forget, to erase, to become someone else, I'd love to hear about it. Drop me a comment below and tell me what you'd trade to silence your deepest sorrow, or what you'd fight to remember even if it hurts. And if these stories haunt you in the same way they haunt me, save this video, share it with someone who loves the dark corners of history, and make sure to subscribe to Unholy Ledger. Because next time we're peeling back the roots of another secret the world tried to bury. And trust me, not all seeds were meant to grow. Ask ChatGPT.